The very first thing I want to do is I want to talk about why do you need to have AI and automation as a core business strategy? And I want to get away from the sales perspective with it. I want to give you just really cold, hard facts, basically, as to why you need to be thinking through this. And I felt that the best way to do this is actually to provide historical contexts of different emergent technologies that have been out there and how this is similar to those emergent technologies. We're not talking about like the metaverse. Like when we heard that came out, I was like, all right, well, there's some good to it, but it's not foundational. Or HoloLens or some of these other ancillary technologies, right? But I think historically, the shift that we're feeling is very similar to like the internet or to the iPhone or smartphone introductions as part of it. But I think it makes sense to talk through a couple of those examples during this session. Even though it's not directly related to commodity processors, the intent is to educate you as to why this needs to be part of your strategy. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to go through what are the successful attributes, obviously, of this transformation as well, because we can generalize and pick out pieces, right, for each of these historical contexts. But what we want to do is we want to understand, like, what was overarchingly successful, obviously, with these that the leaders endorsed to be able to help pivot that. And then also, what are the lessons that were learned out of it? Because not everything was, all strawberries and rainbows and happiness, right? There's a lot of change that occurs with a disruptive technology, and there's a lot of concern too. And I've seen it obviously in the AI space as we've gone through this. And then what I want to do is I want to wrap up with why Microsoft and how you can start before we really conclude this session. So that's going to be the intent, obviously, of what we're going through. And so we've got a lot of content to do. So pitter patter, let's get at it. Let's go ahead and jump in. And I'm looking forward to any of the chat that you do as we go through this session because I will be monitoring that. So first and foremost, why do you need AI and automation in your business strategy, right? Why should you even be thinking about it? You're not even on a current platform, for example. Well, just candidly, because it is so foundationally disruptive. I will tell you without a doubt, this is the biggest shift in business systems that I have seen in my tenure. And that's a pretty broad thing to state because, you could say like the movement from on-prem to cloud, for example. Well, that was a big shift, but the argument there I have with it is that it wasn't a foundational shift in what we were doing. More specifically, you have a server that was on-prem, well now it's in the cloud, and you just have to access it in the cloud. So there's not anything in my mind that becomes substantially transformative of that. Now, did it enable transformation at a more rapid pace? Absolutely, because it did introduce some concepts, obviously, with it. But when it comes to artificial intelligence and the automation needs that we have right now, like I said, there hasn't been anything bigger in this regard, even, for example, with the advent of Power Automate and some of these other technologies. Now, the interesting thing about this is the fact that when we started talking about business systems in the cloud, one of the key messages that we focused around was more around automation. And the reason for that, as many of you have known, as Eric Newell, our CEO, has given a speech on this a couple of separate times as well, really is the fact that we've got a lot of shortages, right, that are culturally a part of both the United States and the global workforce. More specifically, we know we've got labor shortages. We've got birth rate declines that we're starting to see. We've got people saying that if we don't have enough people, we're going to have a collapse of society, right? So there's a lot of need when it comes to being able to do more with less, is what it boils down to. And these are key concepts that really drive automation, I guess, at the highest level as the key driver beyond this. And what I want to kind of just relay with that is for you to start as a leader thinking about this a little bit differently. Don't think about it as AI. Think about it as automation, because the reason we have AI is because automation is required for certain tasks that we need to do in order to scale. We also need to be more competitive, right? Because we're having these automated systems with AI send emails to say, hey, we got your scale ticket. The grading factors came in as X, Y, or Z with it. Thank you. Have a fantastic day. Oh, and your child has a birthday. Here's a $5 certificate for the that child for a birthday present, right? Like these are things that you can start to focus on within automation to really up level your customer experience, right? And the thing about it is that you can do that without with as well as maintaining obviously those profit margins, because what's happening is that there's a lot of pressure on you, as you can imagine, to do more with less, but you can't easily do that without working more, which detracts then as well from the work life balance, which also can affect obviously profitability. And once again, you just get into this cycle of more work doesn't mean better work. So you have to work smarter, not harder. And that is why automation just needs to be at the center of your culture, especially from a commodity processor perspective, because of all the different people, influences, products that you're producing, supply chain disruptions, all those factors really play into that automation perspective. And for you to really thrive, I would argue, in the business environment, you're going to need to be at that level. Now, some of the things of technological shifts, or some of the technological shifts that we've seen in the past, absolutely are akin to what we're looking at right now. Examples of this, as I kind of just get my mug out of the face real quick here, obviously are like steam engines and the telephone and television broadcasting and the internet, right? I could have gone through probably 10 other ones as well, but I wanted to highlight some major ones just to talk through them so you can understand the transformative effect that those technologies had and try to map that then to what we're seeing obviously in the business system space with the introduction of more automation and AI. And the key thing here, like if we start with, for example, even steam power and railways back in the 1800s, we really had a bunch of different leaders that were pushing, obviously, for that. So, as you can see here, like Richard Trevithick, that's going to be the steam engine creator, right, of locomotive steam engines, where George Stephenson was also someone that did the trail and the actual rail design that was standardized, that then made it easier then to deploy a standard rail length size to be able to build these mass transit railways across the United States and technically inside of Britain and United Kingdom at the time as well, right? So there's been a lot of leaders that have really pushed that technology, and that was through a vision that they had with it. Now, the industries that were really impacted, obviously, by the introduction of steam power and railways really were canal companies and also stagecoach services, right? So, canals, ships were typically used for the major transport of products that were a large quantity or a mass amount of product, right? That would then bring it to harbor, from harbor to harbor. But as you can imagine, sometimes going through land is going to be faster and more accessible. On top of that, before rails were invented, stagecoach services would be used basically to take that product and then deliver it by using a horse and buggy at a high level, right? So a lot of these types of changes that were then being introduced then by steam power and the railways affected these workforces. So canal workers, stagecoach operators, blacksmiths and farriers, and also innkeepers and roadside service providers had to transition a lot of their services in order to really then support this new emergent technology that was actually affecting them pretty substantially, right? So we had canal and stagecoach workers actually move to conductors, blacksmiths focused on creating, for example, train tools and parts. And then innkeepers relocated and focused their services around major hubs then that occurred with the railways, along with then cities that became emergent then as part of those railway stations that were created. So this is an example then of a technology that physically disrupted obviously a lot of different workforces, but you can see the theme here already is that the companies and the people that looked at the adaptive capabilities of what their workforce was are the companies and the individuals that won longer term as part of this. Now, another one that's really kind of front of mind is going to be obviously the introduction of the telephone, right? And I can just say pretty substantially Alexander Graham Bell, we all know him. Obviously, he's going to be the one that invented the telephone, right? If you didn't know that. But the key thing here from that disruptive perspective is that that also affected some major industries, right? More specifically, when we had telegraphs and postal services for the delivery of letters and then for the transmission of data, remember Morse code, that type of stuff from a telegraph perspective, that's how messages were actually relayed. That's how we communicated, right? And the telephone was extremely disruptive in that aspect, right? Not only did it all of a sudden switch this where we've got less letters that we're going to be doing, but now we can pick up a device, put it up to our head, and talk to someone thousands of miles away like they're there with us inside of that room. And if you can think about that from a technological perspective, just think of how groundbreaking that would be initially to be like, wow, I can just talk to this person on a phone, which we take for granted right now. Remember, this happened in 1876. Now, the impact of that obviously was going to be, for example, the labor forces, right? So, telegraph operators, you had the linemen, you had messenger services, right? And postal workers that were affected by it. And then they had to pivot as well. So, telegraph operators, a lot of them became switchboard operators, line workers, telephone linemen, right? So, we've got line, which is kind of nice. At least that transitioned fairly smoothly, right? But then when we think about like messenger services that were even used like with postal services, a lot of those individuals then moved into telephone sales or even customer service based roles for it, right? So this is another example then of a disruptive technology that made it so that people had to shift and rethink how they did business really to survive. Now, let's keep going. Let's go something a little bit more modern. Let's get into television broadcasting, right? So television broadcasting, really the leaders in there, and I'm starting to put companies around this because a lot of these types of changes were so substantial that they needed a group of leaders to really move it forward. As an example, when television became more relevant in the 1950s, you really had two predominant leaders. You had Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, and American Broadcasting Company, ABC, that really were at the forefront of introducing then the technologies for consumers then to be able to watch television at home. And I know many of you probably remember some of this, right? There are some people that have experience around in the 50s what was occurring during that or at the tail end of that even in terms of the different types of technologies and TVs that were introduced. But the thing to note here is that this also had a major impact on radio broadcasting, on newspaper and magazine publishers, on advertisers, on entertainers, because it moved obviously from being in person, for example, to watch theater, to now being able to do theater in a screen that then you broadcast to millions of people. And so many individuals, from stage performers to radio personalities, had to shift into television talent or into television engineering, or they had also technologies that were introduced to help offset basically the impact. So cinemas, which still exist today, thankfully, were able to basically introduce different technologies at cinemas that enhance then that movie experience, right? So if you think about it, you've got to basically make sure you're adaptable or thinking how you can augment and drive a more specialty brand or a more focused brand potentially if you're not endorsing that industry head on as you go through it. Even in rail, we saw partnerships that would be created between different companies like canal service companies that would then help obviously their customers with going through the canal system and then going to rail. That's another example of where it was supplemental services that were done to really address that. Now, the internet is really one of the last ones that I want to highlight here, and we're still living that right now, right? We think about the leaders of the internet from the 90s, Amazon, eBay, Netflix, right? I could put Microsoft, I could put Google on there, right? There's a lot of leaders that we've gone through. But in the 90s, remember, the emergent hype that was there wasn't as much Microsoft. It wasn't as much Salesforce, right? In the 90s, I remember using Macs to then go, for example, and order books on Amazon. Not to go to Amazon to buy all my shopping cart stuff, but to go get books. And I remember the impact of Barnes and Noble, for example, in that time period, and how brick and mortar retailers more and more often saw the influence then of the internet from an e-commerce perspective, along with a lot of different traditional media companies as well. And what I mean by that would be video rental stores, right? Like if you think about traditional media at the time, which would have been VHS and possibly as well DVD, more DVD, a little less VHS, right, in that time period. The key fact of the matter, though, is that there's no more blockbusters, right? So there was a massive impact from a labor force. And I actually worked in retail during this time at brick and mortar stores when Best Buy in the 90s was at its heyday, as an example. But retail workers had to move, obviously, to e commerce roles. Travel agents focused on more personalization because now I can go online and book travel through Expedia or whatever service it was. Well, travel agents focused on becoming much more consultative and personalized as they went through it. Bookstores became much more specialized. They weren't the massive Barnes and Noble, as an example. And then video stores had to basically shift to have those types of employees become content curators, for example, for Netflix or customer service reps. As you can see here, there's just a lot that changed in that time period. So let's do this now with AI. Let's pretend that we have seen the full impact. What does it look like? And what's kind of interesting about this exercise is the fact that it looks more disruptive, in my opinion, than any of the other technologies that we have actually looked at. So, as an example inside of here, the leaders, NVIDIA, hands down the number one winner in the AI race. They create the hardware that powers all what we call inferences that are AI based systems in memory. NVIDIA, they are the ones that are driving it. Now, there's other competitors like ATI and a couple others that are inside, or AMD, excuse me, but they're not as relevant, right, at this point. Now, the other leaders, OpenAI with the ChatGPT models, Microsoft for the investment in OpenAI, got a little lucky there. Google, obviously, with Gemini, Meta with Llama, right? And then Amazon, obviously, with their infrastructure. These are the leaders, basically, of AI. But look at the industries that are being impacted by this. This isn't a small subset. This is any business services, meaning any type of consultative services, from starting a business all the way to basically providing functional advice on how to implement software. You've got computer services, for example, developers checking code now to verify and validate that it's correct, or to ask different ChatGPT models, how do you code something? Like, it does that now. Graphic artists, we've heard it everywhere, where you can go online and then create a quick graphic and have some proof of concepts that you can use. Video artists, as we start seeing AI enabled and AI centered video that actually then covers on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen some of these, but they'll do little shorts of like The Simpsons, and they'll have the characters AI generated look like the Simpson characters, but look like a real human being. It's pretty amazing. And it goes even further than that. You've got, for example, a dental and medical technicians. I had a dental technician recently that left their job to go work a different job because the AI enablement and how they actually applied crowns, for example, to a tooth, it can automatically now generate all the conformity needed for that better than that of a human being can, and faster as well. And then doctors, lawyers, education, and agriculture. Agriculture is front and center here today, right? More specifically, precision ag, taking drones, flying them over a field, having them take pictures, looking at the color of the crop to determine what the deficiency is in terms of the nutrient, and then making that information come into your computer system so that way when you're using your Raven sprayer systems, it knows exactly where to apply that chemical, right, as part of that, whether fertilizer, herbicide, or whatever it may be. And it's getting even more complicated, meaning machines that can now, as they're basically driving through crops, identify weeds to take them out so you don't have to use pesticides or herbicides or any type of chemicals to take care of basically those particular plants. So once again, if you don't think that this is disruptive, I'm hoping that this slide just says every industry when it comes to AI right now is actually affected by it, and it's something you need to start thinking through. And the attributes, obviously, of these successful shifts are pretty self explanatory. So, first and foremost, adaptability was key. So, remember, workers and companies that proactively adapted to these technological changes remained relevant because the skill development that was needed, the continuous learning, helped the labor forces transition then those to new roles inside of your organization. And this is something I like to bring up because I don't look at AI and automation as a replacement for human beings or human staff. People want to do business with people. If you don't believe in that, well, you're going to find out very quickly that you will have an inverse backlash because there are many people out there that do not believe that a company should center everything around AI. They still want to deal with people. So this is the benefit, obviously, then of you starting to look at the enablements in your commodity processing organization of how to use AI to really be transformative. Because if you think about it, every technological shift is not going to be disruptive on existing markets, but it's also going to create new opportunities for you because you're able to do more with less. You can do a more personalized email with a scale ticket. You can actually create, for example, orders quickly, or somebody emails you some details and say, hey, create this order. Well, you can actually then take that email and have an AI system enter the order, and it's as accurate as an order entry person. And then also the social changes that are going to be there, the lifestyle changes where hopefully you've got more free time to be at home, right, with your family, and you're still able to keep up with that workload. It's a wonderful thing, and it's a really clear indicator of where you would be in a successful shift then as part of that. So the lessons learned that you really need to know about, though, are pretty front and center. Resistance to change is extremely risky. We are not at the stage anymore where this is a bleeding edge technology. This is everywhere. In Dynamics 365, for example, if you're a commodity processor and you want to see if an ingredient that goes into what you're producing, whether it may be feed or human consumable goods or even animal consumer goods, right? Consumable goods. What's going to happen here is that you're going to see that the companies that start using these technologies are the ones that provide that better customer experience typically. So by not endorsing some of this change, that once again, we're not at the bleeding edge anymore. We've got technologies in F&O that can tell you, for example, if an ingredient is going to be late, that it's going to impact these production orders, right, as part of that process. That's native now. We are getting now into the point where we can actually do targeted scenarios where we monitor, for example, an email inbox, and when an order request comes in, we can create that. Or when a scale ticket gets weighed, that it actually knows exactly who to send that detail towards. And if there's some anomalies in it, it can actually say what those anomalies are and what was detected as part of it. And a human being doesn't need to be in that conversation path. So the key thing to note here is that don't resist the change. You need to start endorsing it now. You need to understand that you want to focus on your consumer focus, meaning who are the consumers of the technology that you're trying to automate to increase the experience or the value of that experience to that consumer, right? And then finally, you'll want to start playing now. You're at the ground floor with this. If you wait 5 years to get your platform up to date to be at this level, you're going to have so much cost that you're going to have to invest in to try to up level your staff, to try to get to that level, that you're basically almost kind of leaving yourself behind, and you're not going to realize the maximum benefit that you can have off of it. So like I said, make sure that you're doing that investment in R&D as part of that. And the thing that you should note here is why Microsoft, right? Why, from a Microsoft perspective, should you be thinking about using Copilot, which is really our AI-based system for your commodity processor organization? And it really is as simple as this. You have a bunch of Microsoft 365 applications. You can ask questions of those apps. So an example in this situation, create me a PowerPoint from this particular Word document that I have. What the system is going to do is it's going to go into, for example, Graph to be able to grab all of your email content and your files and all the details around it. It's going to be able to take that content and bring it over then to a large language model that will be able to look at that detail and identify, for example, oh, this Word document has 7 different sections. I'm going to do 7 different PowerPoint slides with it, and each of those sections is going to have these main points. And what's going to happen is that that large language model is going to also make sure that all the security around it is correct and that it's in a trusted area as we go through this before finally taking that content and bringing it back basically to the end user. Now, I highlight all of this and I put it on the screen here because if you think about it, what's happening here is that it's almost like a question and answer. And if you think about all the different things that you can do with a question and answer based concept, you can do things like ask questions about data. You can tell it to summarize information. You can tell it, for example, to create things such as orders. You can have it notify you when certain events occur, right? And so this Copilot infrastructure allows for you basically to maximize on your investment with Microsoft. And here's the really, really cool thing about it. It's being added to every Microsoft product, from Word to Excel to Dynamics to Azure to custom built Azure OpenAI models that you can create. The list goes on and on and on. It is a 15-year play by Microsoft to basically enable the platform for artificial intelligence and the automation that's really needed for that. So it's a large capability. It's a large capability that you also need to be looking at, obviously, as you go through this. And the big thing here is maybe ask yourself, well, where do you start? Well, what I would say, first off, you need to understand the differences of AI technologies that exist. What is a large language model? What is a large multimodal model? What is a machine learning model, right? These are different technologies that you need to think through and understand. And if this sounds Greek to you, well, you need to start understanding what it is because candidly, you're going to need to know which each of these tools are used and when they're used in order to have the right AI strategy. And we can help with that, obviously. That's what we focus on and that's what we're able to provide. The other thing to note is that you should start experimenting, obviously, with the first party applications at a minimum. If you have the ability to get Copilot for Microsoft 365, get it. Get it for a group of 10 people. Look at how it can actually take your email summaries or your meeting summaries, and then you can take those and identify action items that are related to it, right? There's all these different types of technologies that we can use right now where you can have a very low cost introduction, but you can start realizing what those benefits are. Because in order to know how to use the tool, or how to really effectively use the tool, you have to start using it from the base, right, to do that. And then finally, start getting your teams from a technology perspective embedded in what we call our first party no code development from Microsoft by using Power Apps, by using Power BI, by using Power Automate, because all of those technologies have native AI based capabilities built into it. So, like I said, I highly recommend for you to consider starting to use these different types of technologies to really understand more of where you're going to be going. So, with that, one final thing to note. Remember, Copilot for Microsoft 365 is your everyday AI assistant at work. And what we're going to be introducing in the future here is going to be the concept of Copilot then for agribusiness, right? Where we use AI to make jobs easier. And during one of our prior sessions here, we went through some of those given scenarios where we applied AI to really address those needs. The key thing here for an agribusiness, you're going to want to start looking at where you can use AI to automate, for example, ingestion of orders. You're going to want it for email summarization. You're going to want it, for example, with record summarization, where when you open up a production order, it'll tell you exactly where that production order is in its process without you clicking on 20 different things to understand that, right? So if you think about the Copilot enablement, that's going to be another major thing as you go through this process. So I guess just to kind of wrap it up, because we're a couple minutes over, first off, don't be that company that opposes the change. In agriculture, it is absolutely amazing to me how advanced of a supply chain need you have in agribusiness, but how lacking in technology you are as an industry that really needs to change because you need to acquire new talent. You want people that are excited to use technology to drive these changes, obviously, inside of your organization. But what you want to focus on is identifying the problem first and then seeing if automation and AI apply to it. Don't try to use automation and AI for everything. What you should also be doing, though, is starting the experimentation now, right? By getting some of these technologies in place to basically make sure then that they're performing the way that you want them to perform. And if they're not, that you can course correct as you go through that process. Because no AI system, just like no human being, is ever going to be perfect. And when we're building something that's based off of an imperfect data source, which is human beings' knowledge, you're going to have to figure out how do you identify facts from fiction, right, as you go through that process. So starting to understand how to create prompts and interacting with those prompts is absolutely critical for your business. And then finally, diversify your AI capabilities. And what I mean by that, think of all the different use cases that you can start using, right? An example, summaries created by AI are phenomenal. In all the Dynamics products, for example, when you click on in the finance product, a customer, a vendor, a purchase order, or a sales order, there's this beautiful summarization that now occurs that tells you all about that order without you having to go through every single field to see those values. You've got predictions that are being used in our demand planning application. And then from an automation perspective, with Power Automate, you have the ability to harness prompts using large language models to then create output out of that. So once again, understanding how to use AI then inside of your business by diversifying those specific use case categories, as I call them, is a very powerful thing for your organization.